This is an ad by Regain Couples Therapy and features real testimonials.
This was our first time trying therapy, and honestly, it was long overdue. Looking back, we just wish we had started sooner.
Regain's qualified therapists help couples when they can't get there on their own.
We thought it was intimacy issues, but Andrea helped us uncover a deeper root cause we hadn't even realized was there.
Visit regain.com/couplespod to get 10% off your first month. Regain, powered by BetterHelp.
Good morning, everybody. Hello. Welcome to Lovely Las Vegas for Cuss Soups with myself, Greg Eaps Peterson, now part of the Beats and Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we've got another conference preview today. We're taking a look at the Atlantic 10, and it is going to be a very, very interesting conference to say the least. We'll head out to Chicago in segment number 2 for a man that has joined me on the A10 preview a few times. That'd be Kevin Sweeney. He does great work over at Sports Illustrated, aka SI. He does an incredible job as well with the Field of 68. You go down the list. He is incredible. He also does some work with Trilly Donovan's website as well. We're going to be breaking down all 13 teams, the coaching changes, and so much more. Here in the first segment, I'm going to get you guys the betting trends that we've all seen here in the Atlantic 10, and we're also going to be taking a look at just some of the styles of play and a little bit of the nooks and crannies of this conference. And in the final segment, I'm going to get you guys my projector or finish for the Atlantic 10. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, there's the name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. While I did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by EdgeBoost. EdgeBoost is making sure that bettors are able to have access to their funds whenever and wherever. With EdgeBoost, you're able to get 100% of your gambling transactions approved all the time. And when you go to edgeboost.bet, utilize that promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That'll get you a dollar for dollar match on your first deposit up to $25. And now let's take a look at an Atlantic 10 that has just a lot of different styles of play. They do lose one of their more up-tempo teams in this conference in UMass. They are now going to be a part of the MAC conference, so that, in my opinion, helps them out a little bit because they were one of your lesser teams out there in this conference a season ago. But it is really a melting pot of a lot of different styles. Like we saw St. Louis with Josh Schertz come in and they were bombing a lot of threes, but they weren't necessarily playing a lot of defense. VCU has always been a high-octane team in terms of generating turnovers. Probably not going to be the case this season, and it's going to be interesting to see what their tempo is going to be because now they bring in Bryant's coach in Phil Martelli Jr., and Bryant last year was 6th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. Obviously, that would be number 1 in the Atlantic 10, and with the Atlantic 10, you do have more slow teams than fast teams, as your fastest team last year was UMass at 25, so that scales things down a little bit, and it's going to be very interesting to see what St. Joseph's does as well because they had the coaching change just a few weeks ago. It was Billy Lang at the helm, and now it's going to be one Mr. Steve Donahue. He was over at Penn last season, and with the Quakers of Penn, they were 206th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. For St. Joe's, they weren't like a rocket ship or anything like that, but they certainly were one of the more fast teams that you were finding in this conference. With St. Joseph's last season in terms of total possessions per game, they were checking in at 155th in the country. St. Louis was a very mid-tempo team last year. They were in at 198th. You've got a lot of slow grinder teams. George Mason, certainly one of them. They were 282nd in the country in terms of total possessions per game. Dayton, 258th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. And that's defined as a little bit fast for them. And Duquesne, they really were one of your biggest slugs in all of college basketball last year. 310th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. Davidson was 306th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. So while you do have a lot of different and unique styles, there is a little bit more, shall we say, a low tempo play that happens in this conference, and you do have a lot of teams that they do look to really bomb it from 3-point range. St. Louis, always a team under Josh Schertz that they are going to be looking to take a lot of shots, and they're just going to be looking to be able to get whatever open opportunity that they can get from 3-point range. Might be a little bit different looking this year with Robbie Avila really being the main guy, and they lose quite a bit of that backcourt from the season ago. As last year with St. Louis, they were 6th in the country in terms of percentage of shots that came from from three-point range. They took 50.1% of their shots from three-point range. What's going to be interesting is what sort of a style Penn plays. They were 64th in the country in terms of percentage of their shots that came from three-point range. You've got a team in Dayton that they very much do shoot it well from three. They were only about 132nd in the country in terms of percentage of their shots that came from three, though. Bryant was an interesting team that looked to pound the ball inside last year with having Phil Martelli come in. They're going to be a team of fascination because they were 285th in the country in terms of the percentage of shots that came from three-point range as well, and you did have a lot of efficiency with regards to three-point shooting. Dayton was one of the chief among them really over the last few years. This Dayton team has become a dynamo with regards to their three-point shooting, as last year Dayton was 59th in the country in terms of three-point shooting, and 2 years ago they were actually the number 3 team in all of college basketball with regards to their three-point shooting percentage. You've got a Bryant team that last year, obviously with having Phil Martelli Jr. coming in, they were about 215th in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage. So it's going to be interesting to see what VCU does this season, because VCU always perennially wasn't a great nor a terrible three-point shooting team. You had a Rhode Island bunch that was pretty solid from three, 133rd in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage, and they were one of the more up-tempo teams in the conference last season. Loyola Chicago, they were about 171st in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage, and for St. Louis, I talk about how many threes they just attempted in general, about 106th in the country in terms of the three-point shooting percentage, so neither great nor terrible, so lots of different teams, lots of different styles. Davidson was about 162nd in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage, but what else I do find very striking about this conference, not a lot of teams were really wanting to hit the offensive glass. Over the last few seasons, UMass has been one of your best rebound rate teams in all of college basketball, but they are no longer in the conference. But this is a conference in which you don't have quite as many, shall we say, big men that just dominate. Now, with VCU, they were able to grab a lot of offensive rebounds last season, 9th in the country in terms of percentage of their missed shots that resulted in an offensive rebound. Bryant was 40th, so they should be able to maintain that relatively well. I don't know if they're going to be quite on the same level as they were a season ago, but certainly they did a nice job there. But Dayton was like 205th in the country. Davidson was 327th in terms of percentage of their missed shots that resulted in an offensive rebound. Rhode Island was 215th. St. Joe's was 166th. St. Louis certainly was not grabbing any offensive rebounds whatsoever. 336th. And then Loyola Chicago has always been a make it and take it team. Always one of the best teams in terms of their defensive rebound percentage, in terms of percentage of their missed shots that they haul in as an offensive rebound. Always find themselves outside the top 250, much like they did a season ago. So that's a team of intrigue in my opinion as well. So you've got a lot of teams that they don't necessarily hit the offensive glass, and when it comes to taking a look at the betting trends in this conference, it is a conference that very much does lean a little bit more to the under, just because again, you do have a lot of teams that they don't necessarily play super duper up tempo. They're not looking to gun it or anything like that, but that said, you did have quite a few teams that they were able to hit their threes, and they were able to get you some nice overs, as you only had 4 teams in the conference play more unders than overs last year. Now, St. Louis was a demonstrative under team. They attempted a lot of threes, but they also just weren't as fast as a lot of people expected, with Josh Hurts coming on over from Indiana State. 68.8% of their games went under the total, 22 unders to 10 overs. From there, Duquesne, 17 unders to 14 overs. St. Bonaventure, 18 unders to 15 overs. They were also outside the top 275 in terms of total possessions per game. And then UMass was actually an under team, 16 unders to 15 overs. That's mainly because they were an awful three-point shooting team last year. Dayton, because of their good three-point shooting, 23 overs to 10 unders last year. Rhode Island, 19 overs to 11 unders. Fordham, 20 overs to 12 unders. And it's going to be interesting to see what Mike Magpio does over there. VCU, 20 overs to 14 unders. St. Joe's, 19 overs to 16 unders. And then you had Davidson and George Mason play 2 more overs than unders last year. Richmond, 16 overs to 15 unders. LaSalle, 17 overs to 16 unders as well. And if you take a look at the way that things really, in my opinion, just in general tighten up with regards to conference play, because a lot of these overs, in my opinion, with these Atlantic 10 teams came from non-conference play. When it came to conference play, you did have Dayton be a really nice over team, 13 overs to 6 unders, along with St. Joe's and VCU. VCU 13 overs to 8 unders. You had St. Joe's 14 overs to 8 unders, and then 11 overs to 9 unders with Fordham and St. Bonaventure, 10 overs to 9 unders with Rhode Island. But St. Louis 14 unders to 6 overs. UMass 11 unders to 8 overs. 12 unders to 9 overs for LaSalle, 11 unders to 9 overs with George Washington. Richmond, 10 overs, 9 unders, 11 unders to 10 overs with George Mason. So things did buckle down a little bit more when it came to conference play. And with regards to against the spread trends, you do have a very much a spread out conference where you've got teams in Illinois, you've got a lot of the teams in the northeast part of the country, but you've also got a team out there in the state of Missouri as well. So it does cause for a little bit of rough travel, and it was just a rough year against the spread in general for the Atlantic 10. Only 3 teams were able to hit above 52.4% to be profitable. VCU 20-14 against the spread, St. Bonaventure 19-14, and then Loyola Chicago 19-17. You did have 2 teams in Duquesne and George Washington play one more game against the spread, won than lost, but neither team was able to get to north of 52%. They were both right around 51% against the spread. St. Louis just fell short of expectations, 12-20 against the spread. 12-19 for Richmond. Rhode Island, after a good start to the season, they really cooled off. 12-18 against the spread. Fordham 13-19 against the spread. UMass 14-17. LaSalle 15-18, and then 15-17 for Davidson. 16-17 for Dayton. A break even 18-18 for George Mason, and St. Joe's, they were 17-18. But again, when it comes to hitting the road for these teams, it is always a little bit of a daunting task, and as a result, you saw a lot of these teams just flail. Now, you had a few really good teams on the road. UMass was 8-3 against the spread, but they're no longer in the conference. While Chicago was 8-4 against the spread on the road. Davidson was 7-4, and then Dayton 6-5. St. Bonaventure is 7-6. VCU, St. Joe's, Fordham, Duquesne, they were all break even at 50-50, but Rhode Island was 2-8 on the road against the spread. LaSalle was 3-9. St. Louis and Richmond were 4-9. George Washington 5-6, and then a 6-7 for George Mason. And what I did find with this conference as well was that these teams just really struggled in the role of a favorite, other than VCU. VCU 20-11 against the spread as a favorite, and then St. Bonaventure 13-8 against the spread as a favorite. Davidson and George Washington were both 10-9, but the other 14 teams from last season, they were all below 500. St. Joe's, they were 13-14. George Mason was 13-15. Loyola Chicago 11-13. 9-11 for St. Louis. 9-12 for Rhode Island. 5-7 for LaSalle. 10-15 for Dayton. UMass won 6-9, very nice. Richmond was 1-6. Duquesne was 4-8, and Fordham was 3-6. So those are the betting trends and the style of play that we've got in the Atlantic 10. Coming next, how about if we dive in on all these rosters with one of our good friends, Kevin Sweeney, who does such great work over at Sports Illustrated, aka SI, along the field of 68 and so much more. Right here on Chris Kissy with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Beast and Family Podcast.
This is an ad by Regain Couples Therapy and features real testimonials.
This was our first time trying therapy, and honestly, it was long overdue. Looking back, we just wish we had started sooner.
Regain's qualified therapists help couples when they can't get there on their own.
We thought it was intimacy issues, but Andrea helped us uncover a deeper root cause we hadn't even realized was there.
Visit regain.com/couplespod to get 10% off your first month. Regain, powered by BetterHelp.
And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Cussy with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast. This is the Atlantic 10 Conference Preview Edition, and we've got our board one of our good friends, Kevin Sweeney. He does such a tremendous job taking a look at this great game of college basketball over there at Sports Illustrated, aka SI. I know that as well. He's doing a great job with Trilly Donovan's website, which he does a tremendous job with his show there. I know that he does a show with Eric Fawcett that is awesome. It's called the Scout Team Podcast. And I know that he is doing an amazing job covering all things out there in the great state of Illinois. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter /X at CBB_Central. And Kevin, it's always great to get you aboard. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Good to be back.
It's great to have you aboard. And Kevin, how about if we dive in on a conference I think is going to be oh so interesting with a few new head coaches. And I thought it was a really good hire by Fordham that they brought in Mike Magpio, and he's done a great job in the transfer portal as well. Obviously, he doesn't have a lot returning from a season ago, but Zarik Nutter is a guy that was a bit of a do-it-all sort of player out there in the Sun Belt last year over at Georgia State. DeJure Reeves has been a nice go-to scorer in his career, whether that be at Iona, whether that be at Northern Colorado. Christian Henry is a guy that I think is going to do a good job in the backcourt. And while Fordham might not be like a top 5 team in the conference, I know that they're facing an uphill battle in terms of NIL sanctions, what have you. I know that they're going to be competitive, and I thought that Mike Pio was a really, really good hire.
Yeah, he certainly understands how to navigate a tricky job. And with the job he did at Riverside was phenomenal, obviously connected to that Todd Goldentree and Kyle Smith, and those people have obviously done just incredible work at similar type jobs. We'll see if he can have similar success. I worry about their front court. I know they like the Australian kid, Jack Whitbourne, but that's probably the worst center situation in the league. But yeah, they have proven production in the backcourt, scoring it with Henry and Reeves and Nutter. Also flagged Dimitri Gardner, who's a Division II transfer, who's a big-time scorer. So I'd expect them to maybe get out of the basement or at least be a little more competitive than they were a year ago and see if they can build some momentum in year one.
Yep, absolutely. I think that is going to be massive for them. And then another team with a new coach is going to be LaSalle. And a lot of people are picking this team towards the bottom, but I do think that LaSalle is going to be a competitive team. Are they going to be finishing in the top three? Probably not. But at the same time, I feel like they brought in some rock solid guys via the transfer portal. You know that Darius Nichols is going to have these guys ready to play night in and night out. Marcus Randolph is a hard-nosed guy that comes on over from St. Peter's. Josiah Harris is a guy that knows all about the Nichols style. He's brought in a few guys from Radford, as you've got a pair of Harrises on the roster. Noah Collier was rock solid over at William and Mary. And I mean, if a lot of people are picking LaSalle in the bottom two, bottom three of this conference, that tells me that this is going to be a really good conference this year.
Yeah, I mean, you worry a little bit about Collier coming off of the Achilles injury he had at the end of last season. The hope is that he's healthy, but I have not heard one way or another what his status. Certainly adds a potential wrinkle. I do think Jaden Johnson helps them from Old Dominion at the point. You know, they're just bringing a knife to a gunfight in the NIL space right now, and that's just being frank. I was told that their budget is 5, 6, 7 times lower than maybe the top of the league, and so to expect them to climb is maybe unfair. But as you said, Nichols is a solid coach, and his teams play hard. They play tough. They rebound the ball, especially on the offensive end, and that's a good way to raise the floor, if nothing else.
Yep, I do think so as well, and I do think that with LaSalle, again, are they going to be like a team that's going to be finishing in the top half of the conference? No, but I do feel like they're going to be very competitive right away. And when it comes to this team, I think the biggest thing for them is depth, because I love Dr. Schmidt as a coach over at St. Bonaventure. They always play rock solid defense. Ole in New York always gives them a good home court advantage. If they were to open up a restaurant, though, they'd be doing a knockoff of Five Guys, though, because that's all they played over the last few years. They've had a lot of turnover. Deshaun Bowen, I think that he's going to be rock solid for this team. I love Frank Mitchell, what he's able to provide coming on over from Quinnipiac. You've got guys like Daryl Simmons who should be able to do a good job in the backcourt. But again, where is that depth going to be coming from? Because they're probably going to need a freshman or two to be able to step up. And I just fear that they're going to fall into the ways that they've done in the past, where they've got 5 guys and they start off relatively solid, but these guys just get worn out due to either an injury or just the rigors of a season.
Yeah, no question. I do think a couple of their freshmen, especially in the backcourt, international kids, Ilya Ermakov and Akil Lanati, have a chance to help a little bit in the backcourt and play right away. That's important, especially if Bowen isn't 100% healthy. I know he missed most of last year. You hope for the best, obviously, but you never know. But I think they did a good job. Woj did of finding some maybe undervalued guys. I know there's been a ton of publicity and excitement about Joe Grahovac, who's a junior college transfer, someone who I believe is like 23 or 24 years old, has had a wild journey through basketball, didn't play in high school, kind of quit the game, and has worked his way back from literally playing pickup at a local rec center into now being a Division I player and having a ton of interest. So he's sort of a great X factor to watch. One of those guys, I think, first couple weeks of the season to keep an eye on and see if he's as good as advertised. If he is, it certainly raises their ceiling.
Yep, it certainly will, as we've got ourselves Kevin Sweeney, who does such great work over at Sports Illustrated, AKSI, Field of 68, and so much more, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. And this might now be the biggest unknown out there in the conference. That'd be St. Joe's, because about a week or so ago, it was looking like Billy Lang was going to be their coach. He's now with the New York Knicks, and instead you're going to be having a guy that has been around the block in Steve Donahue, who takes over. He obviously coached at Cornell. He was most recently over at Penn, and as of the time of this recording, none of these guys have entered in the transfer portal. They still have a few weeks to go, but assuming this is the roster that they've got, because it's very late in the process, I think it would be very hard for any of these guys to transfer. How do you see a St. Joe's team that, honestly, from an X's and O's standpoint, I feel like might have gotten a little bit of an upgrade, because with Billy Lang, always a great recruiter, but it felt like his team's underachieved out there on the court the last few years.
Steve Donahue did not finish his tenure at Penn as well as hoped, but he's a proven coach, right? This is not an interim situation with a guy that has never done it, that's walking onto the sideline for the first time. I think the concern would be the buy-in level. As you said, nobody in the portal yet. I don't necessarily expect anyone significant to hit the portal, but what happens if this season starts to go down the tubes early? And it certainly could, given that this team has so many new faces as it is. How much do guys check out? How much do guys start worrying about getting their own numbers to protect themselves ahead for the portal next year? So that's a concern. And the talent level is good. It's not as good as it has been the last couple of seasons. Losing Xavier Brown, losing Rasheer Fleming, losing Eric Reynolds. Simpson and Deuce Jones are solid in the backcourt. I know a lot of excitement about Jaden Glover, who was a big-time recruit to St. John's and just didn't really click there. And then Ajabar is a terrific rim protector. But I don't think the roster is as compelling as years past. And given all of the challenges of an interim coaching situation, it's hard to be super optimistic about the Hawks in 25-26.
Yep, it's going to be interesting to see where they land, most likely in the middle of the conference. A lot of chemistry coming back, but a lot that is going on. Might have a high ceiling, might have a low floor, so that's a big old TBD. And this has been a team that over the last few years, they've just taken a little bit of a step back without Bob McKillop and his son taking over the program, but I really love the fact that they pick up Josh Scovins, who was over at Army last season. Parker Fredrickson a few years ago was a three-point shooting dynamo at Wake Forest, lost season last year. They're not going to have a ton of size. They typically don't, but how do you take a look at a Davidson bunch? And I feel like they made some shrewd moves in the transfer portal, and I feel like this could be a year where they take a few strides forward after it's been a little bit of disappointment here in the last few.
Yeah, I mean, they lose so much in Reed Bailey and Bobby Durkin to just massive pieces of their operation. That's where it gets challenging for me to sit here and say, oh, I like Scovins, I like Friedrichsen, I like Sam Brown from Penn. Like, those are three solid additions, but how does it weigh out in the grand scheme when you're losing one of the best players in the league and Reed Bailey and, maybe the best shooter in the conference and Bobby Durkin? That's the tricky thing. I don't necessarily think Matt McKillop has earned a ton of benefit of the doubt at this point, but there's some interesting kind of buy lows here. And I would also highlight, a couple of these younger international kids, a sophomore, Monty Josies, who was in the rotation as a freshman, and then Ian Platiu, who's a Spanish kid, I believe, who's, super high upside, big, very young, 18 years old. Is it likely that he's physically ready for the Atlantic 10? Maybe not, but I would not be surprised if they have to find ways to get him on the floor, especially given their center situation is a little shaky on paper.
Yep, absolutely. The big men, you don't know what you're going to be able to get out of them, but this is going to be a team that's certainly going to have some guard play, and I think that they're a fascinating bunch. And I look at this team, and I love what Tony Skinn has done ever since he has went to George Mason. He retains Braden O'Connor from a season ago. They do lose a lot of those key pieces that were so good down low, but they really did a nice job of reloading. Riley Allen Patrick comes out over from Sanford, is able to pop threes, and he's 6'11". Nick Ellington was rock solid over at Murray State. Dola Adebayo, he was a nice big man over at Mount St. Mary's. The guard play, I feel like, leaves a little bit of something to be desired. This is not going to be a team that's going to light you up from three, but this is going to be a tough team on defense, and this is going to be a team that they're going to be like going to the dentist. It's not something anyone's going to look forward to.
Yeah, they have such an identity. Had it last year defensively. I think you've done a nice job of getting guys that fit into that. Quite frankly, they were a great example last year of a team that you got some confidence in close games early in conference play and then just started rolling. And there's a team like that every year in this league. It feels like, a couple years ago it was Loyola and Richmond who sort of came out of nowhere to win the conference, and Mason last year was knocking right on the door of VCU. And so, yeah, I think you believe in the defense. I think Fat Hill and Corey Mincy are two guys that are going to have to step up and put the ball in the basket efficiently. They've scored in the past, but in losing situations and not always super efficiently. So I think that's the big thing to watch is, can they get just enough offensively from that group? But I do think the Adebayo Ellington front court is a nice physical group that'll rough people up.
Yep, they certainly are going to. This is a team that has that defensive identity, and they certainly look to be that once again this season. And we do have an interesting team out there in the great state of Pennsylvania. I know that Tristan Freeman has joined me quite a bit to talk about these guys with Duquesne. And what are you expecting from them this year with Coach Joyce in season number 2? And he did a really good job of maintaining somebody of his own. He has guys like Jashawn Corbett coming back. Jake D. Michelle showed some upside last year as well, and clearly going to be a defense-oriented team. But if John Hughley is able to be the guy that we saw a few years ago, and he was a double-figure scorer over at Pittsburgh, do you think that there might be a lot of upside here with this team?
Yeah, obviously last year not the way they wanted it to go, but I do give him credit for sort of keeping the train on the tracks after just an atrocious start, and especially in this era. It's hard. There's a lot of wandering eyes, and did a nice job of kind of keeping everybody in line. I thought the Hughley addition is high upside. It's also, I think, potentially a little bit in the mold of the Zed Key and Posh Alexander disasters at Dayton, where it really is all about his mentality and like, what does he come in wanting to be? Is this his last chance to play college hoops and cash another check, or is this him locked in trying to make himself money overseas? And if he's locked in, as you said, I think he has a chance to be one of the best players in the league. So that's one to certainly keep an eye on. They were really hopeful about Alex Williams from Furman last year. He was hurt, never played. He's back. He's someone I think that helps them on the wing. And just wonder, with the point guard play, is it D. Michelle? Is it Terrence Guignard, who's a transfer from the Ohio Valley Conference and had a good year, not necessarily a great year statistically. I thought maybe a bit of a reach for the Atlantic 10, but better point guard play, I think certainly essential if they're going to take the next step here.
Absolutely. Duquesne going to be a very interesting team and one that has quite a bit of upside with Hughley on the roster. For Richmond last year, it was Murphy's Law. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong for them. It's been a Richmond team that has been very up and down for Coach Mooney. He's a guy that really knows the game, and I just feel like he's got a little bit of a better blend this year. Apollos Romaglu, hopefully I said that correct. He's in year number 2. He stayed with the program. Will Johnson is a little bit of an upside guy that comes on over from Loyola Marymount, spent some time at UT Rio Grande Valley as well. I do feel like AJ Lopez is going to be a really good fit as well with Jonathan Beagle being that do-it-all sort of big man that Richmond has become accustomed to. They always like to have one guy that's like 6'10" that still gives out like 3+ assists per game. And I do think that with Richmond, they're probably not going to be contending towards the top half of the conference, but I think that this roster just looks a whole heck of a lot better than it did a season ago.
Yeah, they just swung and missed so badly last year in the portal. Again, the hope would be some of these guys do a little bit better. I'm still not overly bullish, but a little more proven production with Will Johnson from Loyola Marymount, who's a big-time shooter, AJ Lopez, who knocked down a ton of shots at Maine, and David Thomas from Mercer, and then last year just maybe a little too high at DePaul, but a guy who can score it with the ball in his the I do think the Daughtry and Walls front court is probably the thing to watch. Is it good enough in this league? Defensively, especially, I worry about that. But Chris Mooney has a way of surprising folks when people want to count him out. And it certainly feels like that this year. And I wouldn't be shocked if you look up and say, hey, how is Richmond somehow on the top of this conference right now?
Yep, with Richmond, they seem to always surprise when a lot of people least expect, and Chris Mooney has been in this conference for a very, very long time, knows what the heck he's doing, and this is a program that knows what the heck they're doing as well as Dayton has been at the top of the Atlantic 10 for so long, and they don't bring in as much splash as they did last offseason. Last offseason, Posh Alexander, Zed Key were starters at the power conference level, came in, and Posh Alexander was just a flop. Let's call it what it is. And this offseason, they don't bring in as flashy of guys, but Keontae Jones is a 6'6" guy that does a bit of everything. Jordan Durcock was so good when he was over at Merrimack 2 seasons ago, and he was just stuck in the shadow of 2 top 5 draft picks over at Rutgers last season. Adam Njai is rock solid coming over from the Metro Atlantic. Javon Bennett is back, and I look at the Dayton team, and they're not getting as much hype as they typically do in the preseason, and I think that this is a blend that could be just much better than last year, even though the names aren't quite as big.
Yeah, the Keontae Jones ad totally changes, I think, the calculus here, because at the end of the day, this was a group that I feel like was really lacking in terms of athleticism and physicality at that 3-4 spot, and he's the perfect fit. A guy who flies around athletically, a guy who can pass and play with the ball in his hands, drive it to the rim. He was terrific at Northridge on a top 120 team, which at Northridge is, like making a Final Four. So he's a massive impact yet. Him and Deshane Montgomery, I think, are terrific, and Bennett as well. You have to really like Latong should take a step. I worry about the point guard play. I was not super impressed with Njai at Iona. I thought, at times he was really, really wild. And, especially given some shooting concerns with Montgomery and Jones, somewhat unproven in that regard, to have a point guard who is, not a great 3-point shooter does concern me quite a bit.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that it's going to be really interesting to see what they're able to do for this upcoming season. And this is a team of fascination as well, because for St. Louis, they had such a good starting 5 coming into the season, but injuries to Robbie Avila and a few others just really derailed the season. I feel like they're just better equipped for a big year this year. They bring in Paulo Tino, who was over at Quinnipiac last year. Deion Brown was a really good scorer a few seasons ago over at UMBC last year, was solid over at Boston College. Kalu Anya is someone that was very good at Brown a few years ago as well. And for St. Louis, being able to retain Avila, I think is so big. And I do feel like year number 200 Josh Shirts should go a whole heck of a lot better than it did in year 1.
Yeah, last year they had so many injuries, missed a couple portal evals. It wasn't easy, and they just sort of battled their way to competitiveness. I think they're much more equipped roster-wise to compete. I do think the two names to really watch in their backcourt are Trey Green and Quentin Jones. Trey Green was a big-time recruit, one of the best point guards in the country a couple years ago, playing for MoCan. Went to Xavier. It didn't work out, but could he be in that sort of Isaiah Swope role? I could totally envision that. And then Quentin Jones, a guy that just hasn't been a part of a lot of winning. 6-25 last year at Northern Illinois, 4-28 the year before at Cal Poly. But man, is he talented when you put on the film at 6'5", the ability to play in ball screens, the ability to shoot off the dribble. He's someone that I think maybe there will be an adjustment period for just the intensity level it takes, but talent-wise, he is a plus for this league. Him and Amari McCautry, I think, give them a lot of upside on the wing.
Yep, I do think so as well, and I do take a look at this team, and I think that it's going to be a nice breakout for them, unlike what we saw 8 seasons ago. And this is a team that you're so familiar with, as we've got Kevin Sweeney, who does such great work over at Sports Illustrated along Field of 68, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. That'd be Loyola Chicago, and I feel like they made some nice adds here in the offseason. Dominic Harris spent time over at Loyola Marymount, UCLA, Gonzaga. He's been around the block. He's going to pair up with Justin Moore in the backcourt, who unfortunately had a little bit of injury last year. DeWilk Tavares comes over from Charleston after he was a great three-point shooter for them. They still have Miles Rubin, a great shot blocker. You've got Honusu, I always have a tough time with first name, down low as well. And I look at the overall depth, Joshua Alla Joseph coming on over as well after he began his career at Minnesota. And I think that this is a team that should be at the very minimum in the top 5 of the Atlantic 10. And they might not wow you in one specific thing. They just seem solid all the way around, though.
Yeah, their depth is big time. That's something that I don't think a lot of teams at this level can afford to build. And obviously they invested heavily to keep Miles Rubin. But what has really separated them when they've been good the last couple of years has been the ability to have different guys step up on different nights. And I think they have that type of formula with this group, right? Really 9 or 10 guys that you'd trust to put in the game. And that's not even mentioning a freshman like Chuck Love, who I believe it is the highest rated recruit in program history. I mean, that's the level that Drew Valentine and staff have recruited. You mentioned Tavares. He's a big time shooter, someone I think they can rely on to replace Jaden Dawson, who was a big part of their success last year. But there's a ton of excitement internally about Cade Dotson, the transfer from New Mexico. Probably will get overlooked because the numbers weren't big. He only played like 10 minutes a game, but he was a monster recruit out of high school for UNM, someone that was super, super productive in the EYBL circuit. And he has been, from what I've been told, one of Loyola's best players in practice so far. So when we're talking about guys who could be 8, 9, or 10, maybe on paper, who are 1, 2, or 3 in practice, that says a lot about the depth that they've built. And their backcourt just has a lot more offensive talent and shot-making juice than they've had in the last couple of years.
Yep, they certainly do, and this is going to be a lot of fun to take a look at that team because with the way that they're able to bomb it from three-point range, I think that they are going to be very good out there in this conference, and this is a team I also think is going to be very rock solid as well. How about George Washington? They are going to be getting back Garrett Johnson after he missed all of last season due to injury. Trey Autry, he's back there along with Rafael Castro, but they bring in guys like Gene Arurusian. Hopefully I said that correct. He was very rock solid over at Hofstra last season. Feels like they've got more depth than they've had in past years as well, with a guy like a Boo Boo Benjamin coming in. Christian Jones was a nice solid piece for them 8 seasons ago, should be able to take a stride forward. And I look at this George Washington team, other than Castro, they're a little bit thin down low, but I just look up and down the boulevard at this team and they've got a lot of depth. Getting back Johnson, I think, is big, and they retain a lot of their own while doing a good job in the portal, in my opinion.
Got a Noah's Ark roster. They got 2 of everything, and they're going to be, so much deeper and more talented than they've been. I feel like the last couple of years they've had a couple of guys that really move the needle at a high level, and I think their hope is that they just have fewer holes that you can exploit. As you said, sort of the hierarchy is very unknown. Does Christian Jones take a step, or does he maybe get pushed by guys like Dinkins and Aaron Gurin? Same thing with Garrett Johnson, who's been often injured, really only had 1 healthy season in the last 5 of his career. Are you relying on Garrett, or do you hope that, a Boo Boo Benjamin or someone like that, Tyrone Marshall from Western Kentucky, are able to step up? But at the end of the day, to have the optionality that they'll have does really raise the floor. I think you wonder a little bit about the ceiling with this group. I don't know what their star power is in the backcourt. That is the cost of investing big in 7, 8, 9 guys, as you can't really go all in on the superstar. But at the same time, I think having multiple bites at the apple at every spot is a pretty big positive for GW.
Yep, I do think so as well. And with George Mason, or with George Washington, maybe they don't have that one guy that is just super duper going to take over a game, but having so much depth is big. And then we have to address this team because they've got a new coach out there, Phil Martelli Jr., and his father knows a little bit of something of coaching in the conference, and he takes over a VCU team that has just a lot of talent. Nick Lewis is a top 1 recruit that comes in. They retain a few of their own from ACs ago. Obviously, they bring in the likes of Barry Evans, who he was over at Bryant. Christian Fermin, he's one of the guys that's going to be retained from a season ago. I really like what Jaden Tracy is able to bring to this team as well, a guy that began his career over at Oregon. And I just take a look at this VCU team, and I feel like, once again, there's going to be rock solid depth. We saw that Martelli Jr., well, he might not quite be his father. He certainly knows how to coach, and it's a VCU team that just feels like they're coach-proof, and every single time they lose a coach, they find another good one, and they stay towards the top of the conference.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Martelli's bloodlines are what they are, but did a great job at Bryant and has earned an opportunity, comparable to this. The guys to really watch with this group are Jadrian Tracy from Oregon. I mean, it's just hard to find guys with his level of proven production at the mid-major level. Barry Evans, who they absolutely loved at Bryant. They think he could be an NBA player at some point. And then I think the guy that maybe no one's talking about because of all these high-profile newcomers is Brandon Jennings, who was one of the few that stayed. And he was someone that Ryan Odom was just dying to get on the floor last year. They just didn't have the room. You can only play 5 guys at a time. You have Max Shulga and Joe Pamasio and so many good guards. And he bided his time and sticks around. I think he'll be rewarded. He's been someone that, from what I've been told, has been really, really excellent in practice so far. And I really think that VCU's talent level is high. I wonder about how quickly everybody adjusts and how quickly Martelli adjusts to a different level, but that system is hard to play against with the way that they play pace-wise.
Yep, it certainly is, and it's going to be a fun conference out there in the Atlantic 10. And Kevin, I know you're doing such an amazing job getting set for this upcoming college basketball season. You're great on so many fronts. I know that in past years, you've done a ranking of all 364 teams. That's always a labor of love. You're very much grinding through, taking a look at everything that we're going to get for this upcoming season. So love to get people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, our preview content is underway at sportsillustrated.si.com. We've had things like, freshmen to watch, underrated guys, but also, obviously what to expect from the 5 stars. Some transfer portal stuff that we've been diving into, and we'll have conference previews, a top 25 countdown, and then that 1 to 365 ranking all throughout October. So stay tuned to that. And then, if you're looking more on the video podcast front, Eric Fawcett and I are doing a show every week that is right up a lot of people's alley. It's 25, 30-minute film, deep dive breakdowns of some of the most important teams and players in the sport. It's called Scout Team. You can find it at the Basket Under Review YouTube channel or basketunderreview.com, Chili Donovan's venture. So appreciate you having me, Greg, and can't wait for the season here.
Absolutely. And with Kevin, he's doing an incredible job getting us set for the upcoming season. Every single time he joins me, he lends such great insights. He did so once again today. So a big thanks to Kevin for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. This is the Atlantic 10 Conference Preview Edition. So coming up next, I do give you my projector finish for the A10.
This is an ad by Regain Couples Therapy and features real testimonials.
This was our first time trying therapy, and honestly, it was long overdue. Looking back, we just wish we had started sooner.
Regain's qualified therapists help couples when they can't get there on their own.
We thought it was intimacy issues, but Andrea helped us uncover a deeper root cause we hadn't even realized was there.
Visit regain.com/couplespod to get 10% off your first month. Regain, powered by BetterHelp.
And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be able to get Kevin Sweeney aboard. He does such great work over at Sports Illustrated, aka SI. Taking a look at this amazing game of college basketball. Every single time he joins me, he lends such great insights, and he did so once again today. So a big thanks to Kevin for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast. I give you my projector finish for the Atlantic 10. Since I'm doing a conference preview today, if I miss any news and notes from college basketball on Wednesday, those will be polished up on the podcast tomorrow. I always want these to be standalone, to where whenever you're listening to this, whether you're listening to this on the middle of September, if you're listening to this in like late October, 48 hours before the start of the season, you're able to get some good insights and you're able to know exactly what's going on. So I do think that that is always very important to be doing, and that is why I make sure that these are standalone and we get as much sparkle and shine for these teams as humanly possible. But how about if we go dead last in my projector finish? That's going to be Rhode Island. It just has not happened for Archie Miller. Like, he was such a great coach when he was over at Dayton. Things did not go his way when he was over at Indiana, and ever since then, it has just been a disaster. At Rhode Island, it looked like they were finally going to bust through last season, but they were just unable to do so. They're going to be looking to Miles Corey along Jonah Hinton to really be holding things down, and I do like R.J. Johnson as well. R.J. Johnson, a guy that comes in from Charleston Southern last year, a little bit of a stat sheet sufferer, 13.5 points, 4.5 assists per contest, but he's having to take a big giant leap forward. Began his career over at Holy Cross with Miles Corey, rock solid over at South Alabama last year, 4.5 assists, 14 points per contest, but I do have to have some fair questions as to where a lot of this three-point shooting is going to be coming from for them. Keaton Ujiri, he comes on over after he began his career at Marquette. He was an okay player over at Northern Kentucky, but not really a guy that excites me. Hinton, when he was over at St. Bonaventure, 8.5 points, shot in the mid-30s from three. Just a hodgepodge of different guys, in my opinion, that don't necessarily fit together. You don't have a lot of size other than Mohamed So, who comes on over from St. Peter's, and he's very limited offensively, so I think that it's going to be a big struggle once again for Rhode Island, and I'm just down in general on Archie Miller. So Rhode Island, number 13 in my projector finish, and I do have LaSalle at number 12. LaSalle is going to fight hard, and I actually do think that there are some upside guys. You bring in a few guys from Bradford along with Darius Nichols. They followed him on over as you've got the Harris brothers in Truth Harris along Josiah Harris. They should be able to help elevate this roster along with Marcus Randolph, who comes on over from St. Peter's. St. Peter's last year, he was averaging in that neighborhood about 14.5 points per contest. Spent some time at Richmond to begin his career as well, so he has some familiarity with the Atlantic 10. I do think that this is going to be a team that's going to fight really, really hard. You got someone like a Jerome Brewer, who was a rock-solid player last season when he was over at East Texas A&M, but was limited due to injury. How is he going to be able to come back off that injury after he was limited to 16 games last season? Justin Archer, he's another guy that was over at Radford last year. He was just limited to 3 games due to injury over at Georgia State, but last we saw him, he was averaging 8.5 points, right around about 8 boards per contest, rock solid big man down low, but at 6'7", might be a little bit undersized for this conference. It's a team that's going to have a lot of rough and tumble. Noah Collier is a high upside guy that was over at William & Mary last season, but he dealt with a lot of injury. He has not played more than 21 games in each out of the last 3 seasons, a guy that has now been able to add a 3-point shot, so you have some question marks here, but I know that they are going to be getting the most out of this roster, that is for sure. I think that they made a good coaching hire in LaSalle, though they're number 12 my projector finish, going to be pesky. Number 11 is Fordham, another team that I think is going to have a little bit of a rough go of it, but they are going to be once again pesky. DeJour Reeves was a nice double-figure scorer last 2 seasons when he was over at Northern Colorado and when he was over at Iona. 17.5 points, 5.5 boards per contest, a solid 35.5% three-point shooter over the last 2 seasons, and then they bring in the Harvard transfer in Luis Lesman, who's going to be able to help you out. He was able to give the team 10-plus points per contest. Christian Henry was a guy that I liked over at Eastern Michigan as well. He comes on over after he and the MAC was able to give the team double figures with 14.5 points, 3.5 assists, shot 37% from three-point range. I don't necessarily think that the, shall we say, big man situation is the greatest. You've got Jack Whitborn. He comes on over from UC Riverside along with Mike Magpayo, but he wasn't necessarily even lighting it up there. Akira Jacobs is a guy with versatility that comes on over from Hawaii. He was able to pop it from 3 at 6'9". He was able to haul in there some rebounds as well, and they pair up a few guys that were playing out there at Hawaii's. Marcus Green is also coming over. I remember when he was over at Houston Christian, was really able to put up some big numbers and was solid last year over at Hawaii, but not necessarily the world's greatest three-point shooter, so you do have to have a few question marks there. And with regards to this team, I think that they're going to fight very, very hard, like Mike Magpayo as a coach, but do think that they're going to fall a little bit short here this season as they try to instill that toughness. I've got Fordham as a result, number 11 in my projector finish. And number 10, I go with St. Bonaventure. Again, I just look at the depth of this team, and it is going to be very, very concerning. And we mentioned it with Kevin Sweeney. What are you going to be able to get out of Desante Bowen? Because if this guy is fully healthy, he was limited to 10 games last year, he should be rock solid. In the small sample size that we saw, he was averaging 11 points, 4 assists, 2 steals per contest. Not a guy that's able to light you up from three-point range, but you have to like what he's able to bring to the table. And then you bring in Daniel Igbenniwe, who was over at Tennessee Tech last year, he was able to give the team 6 rebounds per game. They're going to play good defense. They're going to be one of the better teams on the glass. Frank Mitchell, he was a few seasons ago able to be a double-double guy over at Canisius, 12.1 points, 11.6 rebounds per game, and even at Minnesota last year, he was putting up like 5 points, 4.5 rebounds per game. So he was getting good minutes out there in the Big Ten. He's going to be able to do a nice job down low. But outside of Bowen, you just don't have necessarily a ton in the backcourt. They're going to be looking at Daryl Simmons at second to really be able to help him out. And then they just have some like mix and match freshmen, a few international men of mystery. So that really puts it on Simmons to really be able to go out there, light it up from 3-point range. And I'm just not sure if he's going to be able to do so. It's a St. Bonaventure team that's going to play great defense. They're going to play slow and control. But if they have any sort of an injury whatsoever, they're doomed. So in terms of my projector finish at number 10, I go with St. Bonaventure. At number 9, I'm going to be leaning towards Davidson here. With Davidson, I still think that Parker Fredrickson is a nice upside guy. He's going to pair well with Josh Govins. Govins was a bit of a do-it-all guy over at Army last year that was putting up right around 12 to 13 points per contest. With Fredrickson, 2 years ago when he was over at Wake Forest, was averaging 5 points at 36.5% three-point shooting as a nice sixth man. Last year, he just could not find his shot. I think that he's somewhere between A and B. I think that he's going to be in for some improvement this year. Sam Brown is a guy that had a really nice second half of the season last year over at Penn. Struggled towards the first half of the season as that entire Penn team did, but Sam Brown down the stretch was playing some really good basketball. If you look at what he did in conference play, he was shooting 43% from 3, 19.5 points, 3.5 boards per contest, all Ivy League performer. And then Hunter Adam is really your main guy that returns from the season ago, 3.5 points, 2.5 boards, did shoot 40% from 3. Davidson has always specialized in guys with versatility. They're able to pop in and lock it from 3-point range, but losing the likes of Connor Kuchera, Reed Bailey, Bobby Durkin, all those good guys from the season ago, that is going to be very, very rough for this team to be able to replace. I mean, they did their best in terms of being able to do so, but again, it's much like I was fearing with St. Bonaventure. I question the depth of this team. They're going to be bringing in a guy in GQ Roberts who was able to tear it up at the non-Division I level. I think that he has a little bit of upside there, but they just don't have that same versatility with really not a lot of experience at the Division I level outside of guys that are 6'7" or shorter, so they're going to struggle on the glass. As a result, I do have Davidson at number 9 in my projector finish. At number 8, I do have to go with St. Joe's. The team of mystery as a loser coach in Billy Lang just before the start of the season. Now they've got a guy that I thought was relatively rock solid when he was over there in the Ivy League for the longest time, and Steve Donahue. Obviously, things did not go his way over at Penn the last few seasons, but I think that he's a better X's and O's coach rather than what you were able to get last few seasons out of Billy Lang, and it appears as though nobody's going to be transferring out of the program. It's just too late in the process. And Derek Simpson is a nice guy to be able to build around. Was rock solid in his 2 years over at Rutgers last season. Gave the team about 8.5 points, 3.5 assists per contest. Should be able to help run some nice, clean offense. Justice Ajabor, last 2 seasons, has been a guy that's been able to give you a block and a half to 2 blocks per contest. Jaden Glover, a former top 100 recruit that just really didn't see a lot of run over at St. John's last season. I think that he's going to be able to do a nice job being a nice 6'5" stretch player that's able to give you some 3-point shooting. I think his handles are a little bit underrated. And then Deuce Jones, as a true freshman over at LaSalle last year, he had himself a nice year. 3 assists, 12.5 points per contest. Just does a little bit of everything in the backcourt for the team. But how are these guys going to react to everything? Steve Solano is a true 7-footer who he was a top 350 recruit that saw some minutes last year. He's going to be relatively solid as well. That said, you do just have to have a few question marks with this team. There's probably going to be a lot of guys that enter into the transfer portal. I know that Kevin talked about it as well. Do you have a little bit of fear of these guys trying to be able to just get theirs and not play as an actual team with how everything was built on the fly? So I do have St. Joe's at number 8 in my projector finish. Number 7, I'm going to be going Duquesne. Duquesne retains a ton from last season, including Jake DeMichelle along with Jashawn Corbett. Corbett began his career over at Chicago State, and he was really able to blossom towards back half of the season last year. 8.5 points, 5 boards per contest. Not really a guy that's going to light you up from 3-point range, but has the ability to be able to shoot it from 3. Duquesne, one of the slower teams in all of college basketball. The guards are tempo as per usual. Drew Joyce, you could feel like was really getting the most out of his guys last season. The big thing was they didn't have as much of their facilitation returning. Dre Dinkins along Kareem Rozier, both being out of the fold. That is going to be hurting this team a little bit, but you do have a guy in Alex Williams who comes over from Furman, and I think that he's going to be rock solid for this team. Again, not really going to be able to solve the point guard spot for this team, but with Williams, he stands 6'5". He was really rock solid when he was over at Furman 2 seasons ago. 2 seasons ago, he was putting up up a relatively good numbers with right around 13 points per contest. Had a redshirt last season due to injury. A career about 40% three-point shooter, so he's going to be able to add a little bit of offensive spark to a team that really struggled on that side of things. And then John Hughley, I still remember when this guy was averaging double figures at Pittsburgh way long ago. He's added a little bit of a three-point shot to his game, has seen solid minutes at the likes of Oklahoma, Xavier. I think that he's going to come in. He's going to be a nice add for this team. Again, the point guard spot is a little bit suspect. Terrence Gunyard, who comes on over from UT Martin, he's probably going to need to help out a little bit with regards to facilitation. I think that he's going to be able to do so. So I do think that there's some upside here with Duquesne. I've got them at number 7 in terms of my projector or finish. At number 6, I go with St. Louis. We all know about Robbie Avila. This guy is absolutely amazing, but what are you going to be able to get out of the backcourt? Because he and Kalu Anya are going to be able to do a very rock-solid job down low. And for Robbie Avila, he was turning the ball over a little bit too much because he just had not a lot around him with the injuries and just not a lot of depth last season. Like, Avila still put up good numbers last year. 17.3 points, 6.9 boards per contest, but from Indiana State, he was averaging 1.8 turnovers per game in his last year there, 3.3 turnovers per game a season ago, and his three-point shooting percent dropped from about 39.5% down to about 36%. So he became a less efficient player because there wasn't necessarily a whole heck of a lot around him. They bring in Troy Green, who he was just limited to 9 games due to injury over at Xavier last season. 2 seasons ago, he was able to be out there on the floor, just never really got a lot of run with the team. And then Kalu Anya, who returns 7.5 boards. He's a relatively good passer as a big man as well. He was able to give out about 2.5 assists per game. And low-key, St. Louis, even though they were in the top 10 in all of college basketball in terms of percentage of their shots that they took from three-point range from the field, they were a really good two-point shooting team. They were a top 10 team with regards to their two-point shooting percentage. They're also about 300th in the country with regards to their free throw shooting percentage, so something that they're going to need to clean up. But I do think that bringing in Deion Brown, who was over at UMBC 2 seasons ago, last year was at Boston College, is really going to be able to help them out. Not too much of a facilitator, but 2 years ago over at UMBC was averaging right around 2.5 assists, 19 points per contest. They're going to need to put the ball in his hands quite a bit. I think that he's going to be able to succeed in that role along Troy Green, who comes over from Xavier, and Paulo Tino gives the team a little bit more depth down low. Do have some question marks here, but I do think that there's upside from a season ago. I've got St. Louis at number 6 in terms of my projector or fish. And at number 5, I go with George Mason. With George Mason, this team is going to be like going to the dentist because you've got a lot of guys that are going to give you 6+ rebounds per game. Nick Ellington, who comes on over from Murray State. Dola Adebayo, who comes over from the Metro Atlantic, where he was over at Mount St. Mary's. But I think that Masai Troutman is a nice upside guy. A gentleman that over the last few seasons has just dealt with injury, but when he's been out there on the floor and fully healthy, he's been rock solid. Last year at Northeastern, limited at 13 games, but shot nearly 40% from 3, 13.5 points per contest. He's going to add a little bit of offensive excitement, and you need that with Darius Maddox being out of the fold. Braden O'Connor, he's really the main guy that is going to be returning from a season ago, but you've got some really nice mixers and shakers along with him. Corey Mincy was a nice double-figure scorer over at Presbyterian that did a nice job of being able to dish it out. Jahari Long is someone that was over at Maryland, really wasn't able to get a lot of minutes last season, but you're bringing in Jahari Long, who was over at Maryland, and he's a guy that was also at Seton Hall, so this is a guy with power conference experience. But when it comes to Braden O'Connor, I think a lot is going to be on his shoulders, and I think that he's going to succeed in the role. 9 points, 3 assists per contest last season. When he was over at UMass Lowell a few seasons ago, he was a nice 35.5% three-point shooter, and then expanded that last year to shooting 37.5% from 3. Really good defender, and I do think that with George Mason, they're going to play rough and tumble defense, and I think that they've got just enough offense to be towards the top half of the conference. I've got them at number 5 in my projector or finish. At number 4, I go with Loyola Chicago. I really think that they brought in some nice ads. Justin Moore is going to be able to give you more. He was giving you 3+ assists per contest, but he, like many of these guys for Loyola Chicago, was limited due to injury. When he was over at Drexel 2 seasons ago, was a great three-point shooter, but just ran good, clean offense. And then you add in there Dominic Harris. Harris is a guy that has a lot of power conference experience, began his career over at Gonzaga. Last year he was over at UCLA, where he wasn't able to get out there on the floor, but the 1 year where he is prominently featured over at Loyola Marymount, 14.5 points, right around about 3.5 boards, shot 44.8% from three-point range. He's going to be tremendous for this team. And then Miles Rubin is a reason why this team is always so good with regards to their interior defense. He's not necessarily the greatest offensive player, but still had 9.5 points per contest last year, but 2.3 blocks, 5.5 rebounds per game. Not the greatest offensive rebound, but really good on the defensive glass as well. DeWilk Tavares over at Charleston last year was shooting darn near 40% from three-point range. He's going to be able to give this team some nice pop from three-point range. And then Joshua Ala Joseph, he's a guy that I really liked last season over at Cal, was a part-time starter, was shooting about 36.5% from three-point range, and 2 years ago when he was over at Minnesota, shot over 40% from three at 6'7". Nice combo player that I really think fits his system well. I really think the world of Mr. Valentine as a coach as well. You've got Kamani Hunusu as well, 6'7". He's going to give you some nice versatility. Xavier Amos is a nice upside guy that just was unable to get out there on the floor last season for consistent minutes for the Wisconsin Badgers, but had big numbers over at Northern Illinois. Really like the team, so I've got them at number 4 in my projector finish. This will surprise a lot of people. At number 3, I go with VCU. Now, VCU has a lot of talent. Nick Lewis is a top 100 recruit that's going to be coming in, and when it comes to Phil Martelli Jr., obviously he's going to know how to be able to coach in this conference because his father, Phil Martelli, was over at St. Joe's for the longest of time. He brings with him a few guys from Bryan as well. Barry Evans being the main of them, 13.5 points, shot 37.5% from three-point range as a 6'8", little bit of a combo player. Jaden Tracy, he's going to be coming on over from Oregon after he was a rock-solid guard for that team, and they managed to land Tyrell Ward as well. He missed last season due to injury, but 2 seasons ago over at LSU, he was seeing some great runs, shooting 40% from three, 9 points per contest as a 6'6", a little bit of a wing, so absolutely love what he's going to be able to bring to the table for this team. And then you've got Lisa Djukovic, who at 6'10", he had some size coming on over as well from Charleston. Brandon Jennings, I think, is a little bit of an upside guy who's back from a season ago after he played a little bit of a role for this VCU team, but I think that he's going to be able to take some strides forward as well. So you've got a little bit of a mix of the old and the new. Christian Furman, he's a guy that is maintained from last year's team as well over at VCU. Was not necessarily like a starter, but was a nice role player at 6'10". He's going to be able to pull in there some rebounds. So I do think that there's upside here with VCU, but again, you've got Martelli Jr. taking a big giant leap forward and a lot of transfers coming in. So I do have VCU at number 3 in terms of my projector finish. At number 2, I go with Dayton. Dayton brings in Jordan Durcock, who I really like. He still had a solid year over at Rutgers. It wasn't quite what we saw when he was over at Merrimack 2 seasons ago, where he was just absolutely lighting the conference ablaze. He was the player of the year out there in the NEC, averaging 17 points, 6 boards, 4 assists, 2 steals. Not a guy that's going to light you up from three-point range, but man, at 6'5", he's able to do a little bit of everything. But having Javon Bennett back, I think is big along Keontae Jones. Keontae Jones, when he was over at CSUN, aka Cal State Northridge, this guy at 6'6" was just doing it all, and I think that he's going to fit so well in this Anthony Grant style. 13 points, 9 boards, 4 assists, 38% three-point shooter. There's not a thing that this guy does not do. And then you bring in Deshaun Montgomery as well. Montgomery had a nice year over at Mount St. Mary's 2 seasons ago, limited due to injury over at Georgia last season, but when he was out there on the floor was still relatively effective. And then with bringing back Javon Bennett along with Emil Latang, I think that this team has a nice just sort of core from 8 seasons ago with Leia Tang. He last season was able to put up about 7 points, 4 boards at 7'1". He's going to be a nice clogger down low, was able to give the team a block per contest, and having back one of those fulcrum pieces from last season's backcourt in Mr. Bennett, I think is just so big, because when you're able to bring back someone that was able to give you multiple assists per contest, 11 plus points per game, while being able to shoot about 39% from 3, that really solves a lot of the riddles out there in the backcourt. And even though you don't have as much star power, a guy like an Adam Njai, who was really blossoming towards the back half of the season over at Iona, he was starting as a true freshman for them at the point guard spot. I do think that there's a lot of upside here, and I do think that Dayton has really, really good coaching. So I've got them at number 2 in my projector finish, but number 1, I have to go with George Washington. They did a really nice job of bringing in guys via the transfer portal. Gene Amarujian last season over at Hofstra was a 10-plus point per game scorer who was able to light you up from three-point range. Boo Boo Benjamin was very rock solid as one of the main guys over at Tarleton State. I know that Tarleton State had a bit of a rough season, but when Benjamin was out there on the floor, he was able to give them good production with about 14 points per contest, shot 38% from three-point range. But really the biggest addition is a guy that was on the roster last year but just did not play. Garrett Johnson missed all of last year due to injury when he was out there 2 seasons ago at 6'8", 13.5 points, 5.5 boards, 40% three-point shooter. They bring back Christian Jones from a season ago, the guy that's able to give you 2.5 assists, shot 35% from 3, 8.5 points per contest. Rafael Castro, your main big man, is also back as well after he gave the team 9 boards, 14 points per game. This is a team that's able to give you really good explosive offense, but they're able to do a nice job down low with Castro. They're going to have Johnson being able to give them quite a few rebounds. Trey Autry was a 10-plus point per game scorer last season. Trey Moss is a guy that has been around the block and is rock solid. And Tyrone Marshall, who comes on over from Western Kentucky, he just does a lot of things well. Maybe he isn't the world's greatest three-point shooter or anything like that, but the guy stands right around about 6'6", 6'7". Last year, 10.5 points, 6.5 boards, relatively good defender, is able to generate a little bit over a steal per contest. Just very complete players on this George Washington team. Maybe they don't have that go-to scorer, but I think that by the end of the year, Garrett Johnson is able to become that. And like our good friend Kevin Sweeney said, this team has two of everything. I have got George Washington winning this conference. I've got them number one in terms of my projector or finish. And that'll wrap things up for the A10 Conference Preview Edition right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. If you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters EM maybe does not matter, so per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is via an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I am with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. And that means that I'm going to be right back with you guys tomorrow. And we've now got just the Power 5 conferences left to do conference previews of, and you're going to be getting those within the next few weeks. And you'll have a fresh podcast tomorrow. Thank you so much for tuning in.
This is an ad by Regain Couples Therapy and features real testimonials.
This was our first time trying therapy, and honestly, it was long overdue. Looking back, we just wish we had started sooner.
Regain's qualified therapists help couples when they can't get there on their own.
We thought it was intimacy issues, but Andrea helped us uncover a deeper root cause we hadn't even realized was there.
Visit regain.com/couplespod to get 10% off your first month. Regain, powered by BetterHelp.